Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're doing well. We're continuing our Wayside School is Falling Down series. We're on chapter 18, The Substitute. Benjamin couldn't take it any longer. Today was the day he would finally tell Mrs. Jules his real name. So what if nobody likes me? He thought. So what if I stop getting high marks? Hi, Mark, said Jason. Hi, Mark, said Stephen. Hi, he glumly replied, then started up the stairs. Hey, Mark, said Bebe, as he took his seat next to her. Guess what? We have a substitute today. Woohoo! Shouted Mauricia. Everyone in Mrs. Jewell's class loved it when they had a substitute teacher. They loved playing mean and horrible tricks on them. Benjamin frowned. He had finally had the courage to tell Mrs. Jewell his real name. Rats, he said. That's a good idea, said Terence. We'll put dead rats in the desk. Let's trick her into going outside, said Joy. Then we can lock her out the room. But what if she tells Mr. Kidswater, said Eric Fry. So what, said Joy. She'll have to go all the way down to the office and then all the way back 30 flights of stairs. But by then, we'll unlock the door and Mr. Kidswater will think the substitute teacher is bonkers. Benjamin looked at the substitute teacher sitting at Mrs. Jewell's desk. She looked like she was a nice lady. She wore tiny spectacles and had long gray hair tied in a ponytail. He felt like he could tell her, and he felt sorry for himself. I was going to tell Mrs. Jules my name, he thought. I really was. The substitute stood up and walked to the center of the room. Good morning, she said. My name is Mrs. Franklin. Nobody said good morning back to her. Calvin handed Benjamin a note. At 10 o'clock, drop your book on the floor. Pass it on. Benjamin read it, then passed it on to Todd. Okay, who can tell me what page we're working on? Asked Mrs. Franklin. Page 17, called Myron. No, it's page 112, said Mauricia. No, it's 98, said Eric Evans. No, we're on page 3000, said Joe. Mrs. Franklin smiled. I guess we'll have to study all of those pages, he said. Benjamin raised his hand. Yes, the handsome young man in the red shirt, said the substitute. He told her the correct page. We're on page 102, said Benjamin. Thank you, said the substitute. And what's your name, please? Benjamin thought for a moment. He looked around the room, then boldly, finally told the truth. My name is Benjamin, he stated proudly. Several kids started to laugh. Thank you, Benjamin, said the substitute. There were more snickers. You're welcome, said Benjamin. He felt good, even if the other kids were laughing at him. Mrs. Franklin asked a question from page 102. Jason answered it correctly. Very good, said the substitute. And what is your name, please? Jason looked around. Benjamin, he asserted. Half the class started to giggle. Thank you, Benjamin, said Mrs. Franklin, and the other half of the class started to giggle. Dana answered the next question. And what is your name? Mrs. Franklin asked Dana. Benjamin, Dana blurted, and then she fell giggling onto the floor. Thank you, Benjamin, said the substitute. Everyone was hysterical. My, it is certainly a pleasure to teach such happy students, said the substitute. Who knows the answer to question number 4? They all raised their hands. They all wanted to tell the substitute that their name was Benjamin. They were having so much fun, they forgot to drop their books at 10 o'clock. At recess, everyone congratulated Benjamin on his great trick. You're a genius, Mark, said Todd. Benjamin is such a funny name, said Jason. How'd you ever think of it? But my name really is Benjamin, said Benjamin. Yeah, so is mine, said Stephen. Mine too, said Leslie, and they all started to laugh. Do you think she really believes we're all named Stephen? Or we're all named Benjamin? Asked Eric Evans. Probably, said Joy. I don't think that substitute's too bright. If she thought we were lying, she would have gotten mad, said Eric Bacon. The bell rang, and they all hurried back to class. After recess was social studies. Who would like to read? Asked Mrs. Franklin. Every hand went up. Okay, Benjamin, said Mrs. Franklin as she pointed to Dana. Everyone laughed. Dana giggled a few seconds, then got control of herself and read from the book. Thank you, Benjamin, said the substitute when Dana was finished reading. Okay, Benjamin, you may read next, as she was pointing to Terence. Everyone started to laugh. It was the first time all year Terence had volunteered to read. All day, everyone paid very close attention. They all wanted the teacher to call on them. because as funny as it was when Mrs. Franklin called somebody else Benjamin, it was even funnier when she called you Benjamin. So everyone worked hard and listened closely. As a result, they learned more from the substitute in one day than they usually learn from Mrs. Jules in a month. When the final bell rang, everyone crowded around her desk. "Are you coming back tomorrow, Mrs. Franklin?" asked Eric Bacon. "Please, Mrs. Franklin, say you will," pleaded Kathy. "You're the best substitute teacher we ever had," said Jason. The substitute smiled. "School is over. You don't have to call me Mrs. Franklin anymore. That sounds so formal. Since we're friends now, you can call me by my first name." "What's your first name?" asked Mauricia. The substitute gathered up her things and put them in a straw bag. "Benjamin," she said, then walked out of the room. Everyone stared silently at her. "Do you really think her name is Benjamin?" asked Joy. Chapter 19, the first of 3 Chapter 19s. A bad case of the sillies. Well, Allison started up the stairs 5 minutes before the bell rang for school to start. The stairs were completely empty. Allison liked it that way. When the bell rang, the stairs would be crammed with thousands of screaming kids scurrying to their rooms. But now it was nice and peaceful. She walked up past the 18th story towards the 20th story. There was no 19th story in Wayside School. Miss Zarvis taught the class on the 19th story, but there was no Mrs. Zarvis. Allison didn't understand it. If there was no 19th story, then wasn't her class really on the 29th story? Suddenly, she heard footsteps charging up behind her. She turned around to see Ron and Dee Dee racing. She leaned against the wall to get out of the way, but Dee Dee stamped on her foot. Then Ron elbowed, jammed her in the stomach. "Ugh!" she grunted as she fell and rolled down the 3 steps. Dee Dee and Ron didn't even stop to say they were sorry. Allison slowly stood up. Fortunately, she wasn't hurt, but her windbreaker was torn. She thought Ron and Dee Dee were silly. They raced up the stairs, and then when they got to Mrs. Jules' room, they were too pooped to learn anything. Allison thought of all the kids in Mrs. Jules' class were silly, even Rodney, and Rodney was her best friend. Then there was Jason, who was always pestering her. That was because Jason hated her, or else he loved her. Allison wasn't sure which was which. When she got to class, Dee Dee and Ron were sitting with their heads flat on their desk and their tongues hanging out from running up the 30 flights of stairs. "You could have said you were sorry," Allison said as she walked past them. She sat up straight in her chair, folded her hands on her desk, and waited as everyone else wandered in. Jason entered the room carrying a glass bowl with a goldfish swimming inside it. "Look what I brought," he said. "What's the name of your goldfish?" asked Mrs. Jules. "Shark," said Jason. All the children laughed, and Allison rolled her eyes. "It makes him feel important," Jason explained. "Where should I put him?" "How about on top of the coat closet?" suggested Mrs. Jules. Jason had to stand on the chair on his tippy toes. He held the bowl at the very bottom as he tried to nudge it over the edge of the closet. Suddenly, the chair toppled over. "Ah!" yelled Jason as he fell on the floor. He was holding the bowl upside down above his wet face. Mrs. Jules hurried to the back of the room. "Quick, somebody! Fill the bowl with water," she said. "Where's Shark?" Jason made a face. "I swallowed it." The class went crazy. What a show-off, thought Allison. Mrs. Jules rang her cowbell and told everyone to settle down. "You have a bad case of the sillies this morning," she said. She took roll. "Now, let's see. Who's absent?" she asked. "Allison," said Rodney. "Very funny, Rodney," said Allison. "Anybody else besides Allison?" asked Mrs. Jules. "I'm here, Mrs. Jules," said Allison. She sat behind Eric Fry, so she thought Mrs. Jules couldn't see her. Eric Fry was the biggest kid in the class. "Just Allison, then," said Mrs. Jules. She marked it on her green roll card. "Damon, will you please take the roll card to the office?" Allison stood up. "I'm not absent," she said. Damon took the roll card back and walked out the door. "Mrs. Jules, did you just mark me absent?" asked Allison. Mrs. Jules didn't answer her. Allison marched to her desk. "Mrs. Jules, did you mark me absent?" she asked again. Mrs. Jules looked up. "Terrence, what are you whispering about?" "Nothing," mumbled Terrence. "If you can say it to Jenny, you can say it to me," said Mrs. Jules. "Okay," said Terrence. "Get off my case, buzzard face." "Terrence," said Mrs. Jules, Go write your name on the blackboard under the word discipline. But that's what I said to Jenny, Terrence protested. Mrs. Jules, what about me? Allison demanded. Mrs. Jules ignored her. Allison screamed as loud as she could. Mrs. Jules didn't hear her. Allison faced the class. Can't anybody see me? She asked. Nobody answered her. Rodney, shouted Allison. Dana! Jason! This isn't funny, said Allison. I know you're all just pretending. She stood right in front of Jason, leaned over his desk, and stared at him straight in the eyes. I know you can see me, she said. You're trying not to laugh. He stared right through her. She stuck out her tongue at him. He leaned forward, causing Allison's tongue to accidentally lick his nose. Yuck! She exclaimed, then wiped her tongue on her sleeves. Mrs. Jules began the morning lesson. Have you gone crazy? Shouted Allison. She ran out of the room and down to the class on the 29th story. Come quick, she said. There's something wrong with Mrs. Jules' class. No one heard her. She slammed the door, then continued down the stairs to the class on the 28th floor. No one saw her either. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Is the whole school playing a joke on me, she wondered. It's not funny, she shouted as loud as she could. She continued down the stairs, screaming anything that came to her head, hoping that someone, somewhere, would notice her. Fish for sale, fresh fish, get your fat fish, get your fresh fat fish. Suddenly, a tall, skinny lady with very short hair stepped out of the classrooms. Shh, she whispered. This is a school, not a fish market. You can hear me? Asked Allison. She was so happy she wanted to hug the woman. Yes, I can hear you, the woman said sternly. My whole class can hear you. You're making it impossible for us to get any work done. I'm sorry, said Allison, but something's wrong in Mrs. Jules' class. You better come in here, said the teacher. Allison followed the teacher into her class. What's your name? The teacher asked her. Allison? Boys and girls, this is Allison. The teacher announced her to the students. She'll be joining our class. What? Said Allison. But my name is Miss Sarvis, said the teacher. Welcome to the 19th story. Have a great rest of the day.